All right, today's movie retrospective, this was one of the first movies I wrote down when we started doing a list, when we first started thinking about doing movie reviews. So I've been wanting to do this almost from the beginning of when we started this series. And this is the 1978 quasi-vampire film, Martin. Yeah. Directed by George A. Romero, who obviously, this is actually kind of one of his lesser-known movies. Obviously, he's best known for all his, his zombie saga. So I kind of feel like a lot of his other movies sort of go under the radar a lot more just because his zombie movies are so iconic and so popular and so influential. But he actually did make, I think his zombie movies were only about half of his movie output over the years. So he actually did make things about a lot of other types of, in a lot of other kind of horror things in the genre. He made The Crazies I think it came out in 1973, which kind of presaged the whole 28 Days Later rage virus zombie type of thing. It's not really a zombie movie, but it's about, a disease outbreak that makes everybody ragey or whatever. Now, Martin came out in 1978, and it was kind of Romero's take on the vampire genre, but in much the same way as his zombie films were kind of like a modern updating of the original zombie legend, the ghoul legend. Martin is kind of his updating of the vampire mythos. And he's almost kind of playing with the idea of the realism of vampirism versus the mythology of vampirism. I've actually seen this movie called like a vampire version of Taxi Driver. Which I think that's kind of accurate.
I guess so, yeah.
Yeah.
I'd never seen this before. Last night was the first time I had seen the movie.
It's a really interesting kind of movie. And the thing about it is that one of the things I love about this movie, and I think contributes a lot to kind of the overarching feel of it, I'm going to say it's a horror movie, but it's only nominally a horror movie. It's almost kind of like a gritty 70s drama with like vampire elements. I almost want to say it's kind of like, if you guys have seen like Abel Ferrara's Driller Killer, it kind of reminds me of that sort of thing, where it's like the whole thing is set in this really decaying suburb of Pittsburgh, like outside of Pittsburgh. Everything is just brown and grotty and gross and depressed.
It looks like Detroit.
And that really contributes a lot to kind of the, like all the decor is like so 70s.
It's pretty interesting to see if you're old enough to remember those kind of times. I mean, you're seeing 60s cars and 70s cars and how crappy paint was back then and how quickly a car would fall apart. It's like 77 or 78. What'd you say it was? 78 when this was filmed?
Yeah, it was filmed in 77, but it
77,
came out in 78.
Yeah, and you can see that some of these cars are late 60s and they're already falling apart. So, only a few years later the cars were decaying, so nothing was really built well back then. And if you look at the interior design of the sets, it was pretty mundane, pretty bad
Well,
quality.
And they weren't even sets. I mean...
Yeah, they were people's houses.
Yeah, I mean, the main set of the house, which was Tanta Kuta's house, was actually I think it was the sound guy's grandmother's house. So that was her actual house. They didn't do any really set.
Yeah, and it kind of puts a different feel to it because a lot of times movies from the 70s are filmed in really kind of special locations or opulent locations, which that doesn't really give the modern viewer, the real feel of the way the 70s were. I can remember the way the 70s actually looked in most places. Didn't look that good.
Yeah, everything just looked dirty and cheap and brown and yellow.
Most of the United States kind of looked like a developing third world country by today's standards.
So it was so like I said, this movie, it's kind of like a drama with, like, as I said, horror elements. Now, don't go into it expecting, like, a fun movie. This is kind of a bummer. It's kind of a downer. It's more of a character study than any of his other movies. It kind of concerns, and this is kind of an interesting thing about how this movie starts. The opening sequence of this movie establishes right away the main character of Martin is essentially a serial killer.
Yeah.
I mean, he's stalking a woman on a train. He basically drugs her, opens up her wrists with a razor blade, and drinks her blood.
Yeah.
But then, after this opening sequence, in which we see, like, so much is kind of said in the opening, like, set up in the opening sequence, because Martin sees things as though he is like the classic movie vampire.
Yeah. This dude thinks he's a vampire. He's actually a serial killer.
When you see things from his perspective, everything is it's in black and white. It's very romanticized. It looks like, like an old vampire movie with these buxom ladies in their old white dress, and they're like calling to him. And then there's all these villagers with torches like trying to get him. And he looks all suave with his like unbuttoned what he looks all like Wuthering Heights and shit. So that's how he sees things going on. But this great opening sequence not only did establish, like I said, that he's a serial killer. It's a nasty sequence because it's filmed so realistically. It's not quick edited. It's not anything like that. It goes down in this little bitty, sleeper car in a train. But so he breaks into this woman's sleeper car on this train, and he has an idea in his head. He sees in black and white. He sees the woman in this dress, and she's got her arms outstretched to him and everything like that. And then they cut back to the reality where she's in the bathroom. You hear the toilet flush. It's like, she comes out of the bathroom and she's like blowing her nose, and she's got like, what do you call it, beauty mask shit all over her face and everything like that. So it's like she doesn't look romantic in the least. It's like she looks like she's ready for bed. She's got a big fluffy bathrobe on and shit. And then they have like this big struggle. Now, the interesting thing about this, though, is that after this very long opening sequence where it's established that he is a killer, that he drinks people's blood, he drugs women, it's implied that he raped them. I don't really know if he does. It's not really made super clear.
No, I don't think so, because later on,
Yeah, there are some things he says that it could go either way. So then he kind of makes it look like a suicide and leaves. And then you kind of get this mysterious sequence where he gets picked up at the train station by this creepy old dude, like in a white suit. And at first you're not really sure what the relationship between these two is. He's just kind of like, come on to the house, and like, this kid's just like following behind this old guy. But then as the movie goes on, the great trick that Romero pulls is that he gets you to sympathize with Martin. Even though from the jump, the very beginning of the movie, he shows Martin doing these horrible, horrible things, and yet he's still a sympathetic character.
Yeah, kinda.
You know what I mean? And I think it's because the central conceit of the movie is that you are not sure. He thinks he's a vampire.
Yeah.
The old guy in the white suit, who you later find out is his much older cousin, Tanta Kuda, who he has come to stay with, presumably after the other members of his family have died or whatever. I think they kind of imply that later on. But he's kind of the last of the line to look after this kid. Now, Tanta Kuda is very old school. He's Lithuanian, actually. Very religious. And he also believes that Martin is a vampire, but in the old school garlic and crosses kind of way.
Yeah, this guy here, he's related to Martin.
Yeah, they're cousins, I think.
You find out that there's been vampirism in the family, but you also find out there's insanity in the family. And this cousin of his basically is kind of like the Van Helsing of the family, keeping track of who the vampires are. And so there's a reason why Martin thinks he's a vampire. And, really, I was watching it, I was wondering whether or not he really was a vampire. Depends on how you define vampire, He wasn't the undead, but he didn't claim to be.
Yeah.
And it was never really claimed anywhere in the movie that they believed that the vampires were undead. They just thought vampires were people that killed people and drank their blood, which that's what Martin was doing. And another thing that was weird about the movie is that the movie is kind of shot, if you ask me, it's shot almost like in a homemade way. It's written pretty well. You can tell that the movie was originally a lot longer and edited down into this.
The initial cut was 2 hours and 45 minutes.
Yeah, and it's still a little long by today's standards, but it is an interesting watch. It's not a modern movie, but it is a pretty good movie. It's got a lot of good ideas in it. I would say the movie was probably ahead of its time. I can understand why it's kind of a cult movie. I was watching it and it was really reminding me of a serial killer that was around about that time. It might have been the early 80s. I think his name was Chase. Something or other Chase. He was known as the vampire killer who was running around killing people, drinking their blood. It's a lot like that, and that was a real life case. Do you think of that guy's name off the top of your head?
I think I know who you're talking about.
I think his last name was Chase out in California. So I'm watching the movie and I'm going, yeah, there was a guy that was actually like this.
Yeah.
And it made me wonder if that guy was influenced by this movie or not.
Maybe.
Because I think, and of course this is off the top of my head, I think the Chase case happened after this movie. So I would imagine he probably saw this movie.
It could be. I mean, it could very well be.
And Martin's doing a lot of stuff that serial killers of the 70s did. Stalking people and getting into their houses and busting in on women and having weird relationships with women. It's interesting from that point of view. I really liked the soundtrack. The music I thought was pretty cool. I really
have to call out the score. It's
eerie.
Very, very cool. It's like it kind of wavers between kind of like an old gothic like piano type of thing and like kind of a free jazz saxophone kind of thing. Yeah. And it really works. I should point out while we're talking about the score, if you've ever seen, which I have not, and I don't know if I'd want to see it, but the Italian cut of this movie, which is called Vampire, actually has a score by Goblin, obviously most famous for doing most of Dario Argento's movies, and they're kind of a prog rock band, so I don't really know. I don't think it would work. Maybe it does. If any of you have seen it, like, let me know in the comments, but I don't know if I want to watch it because I really like the score of this so much, and it really fits in with this whole bleak sort of atmosphere that this movie
Speaking
evokes.
of atmosphere, we got a storm going on outside, so you might hear some thunder.
Yeah,
and lightning.
if anybody hears thunder, that's what it is.
It's just vampire atmosphere.
Yeah, we didn't add that.
No.
That's actual Florida atmosphere. It's like
Yeah.
storming outside. So yeah, but that was another thing I wanted to say too, is that there's another interesting thing too, is that George Romero does, and actually George Romero is in this in a cameo.
So is Tom Savini.
And Tom Savini, this is actually the first time that Tom Savini had done effects for a George Romero movie.
Yeah.
And and he's also in this in a small role as he plays the Kuda's granddaughter's boyfriend, Arthur, and he's in a couple of scenes. But he also did all the effects for this. It's not a super gory film. Most of the blood is kind of like, just slitting wrists and things of that nature. So it's not like the zombie movies where heads get blown off or anything. But it's, kind of like that.
You can definitely tell that this movie was a series of movies that came from a bunch of friends who were basically kind of doing this on in a bandit style way, on a very low budget. But they were talented.
Yeah.
And if you liked Night of the Living Dead, this is kind of a must-see movie. I think anyone really who's into the horror genre, or, maybe new to the horror genre, really should watch something like this, because this does kind of take it back to the roots. And it does have just a really gritty, kind of realistic feel to it. And we weren't really watching a restored version of it by today's standards. It was a DVD.
I just have the DVD, like the old DVD.
Right.
I think it's Anchor Bay, whenever that came out.
Yeah, and you can tell the footage looks pretty aged, the transfer, and that kind of adds to it in a way. It looks like old crime scene photographs. It looks like,
That's one of the and I think we might have mentioned this on another, I don't remember what review it was, but another one where we were talking about like old 70s movies and how that seems like a really hard thing to be able to do in the modern era is to give something that feel of looking like a snuff film.
Yeah.
Like something that you found, like some old videotape you found in the bottom of a box in a garage or something.
You kind of get this feeling that you're watching something you really shouldn't be watching.
Yeah.
That's like it's going to get you dirty.
Yeah, that's what I mean. Yeah, you're not supposed to be seeing this. You found it somewhere like in a ditch or something. And it's like, this definitely does have that look to it, except,
Looks like it was made by bad people.
Yeah.
But then like in the special features, you hear of Tom Savini and everybody talking about making the movie. And they're just like cool, regular or normal people made the movie.
Well, and George Romero, obviously he's passed away now, but he always seemed to me, and from what I know from everyone that I've heard of that has met him and things, that he just really seemed like a genuinely nice man. They said he was just a nice man. He was very down to earth.
With unironic glasses.
Yeah, and and he was, the quintessential independent artist.
Yeah.
This movie was made for, I've seen figures between $80,000 and $250,000.
Right.
It only got a limited release later on, not like his zombie movies, which actually did much better, because this one, like I said, kind of under the radar.
You could tell that these were guys in vans just with cheap cameras jumping out and making movies, but they were well thought out. They were well written.
Yeah.
You couldn't do this today. If you did this today, it would look a lot more modern.
It would look too good.
It would look too good, and no one would take interest in it, because there are a lot of people making cool movies and nobody even sees them.
Well, the thing
it had to do with the place and the time, and also the location. In a rotten old place in Pittsburgh, but it looks like it's fallen down, in most of the places.
And that really, like I said,
it adds to it.
It kind of helps establish the mood, because what I was going to say previously when I first mentioned George Romero being in this movie was that he has like a bit part as a young priest, and he comes over to Tantakuda's house because I guess he's just moved to the parish or whatever. Yeah. And so Tantakuda invites him over. And so George Romero is like this young priest. He's like, hey, more wine, man. I'm going to eat all your food and all this. And he's all cool. I'm the cool priest. And you can tell that Tanta Kuda is not having it. He's like, the old people don't like priests like you. We believe in demons and we believe in stuff. And then there's kind of this awkward kind of, and the granddaughter's like, Tanta Kuda, can you please shut up? It's like, you're really making everything awkward for everybody. So there's really this whole thing about ancient beliefs versus modernity.
Yeah.
And then there's an interesting thing, too, about belief and how beliefs influence reality. Because here's the thing. Tanta Kuda believes wholeheartedly that Martin is Nosferatu.
Yeah.
Like in the old school sense of the word. He brings out the old family albums and he's like, and this one's a vampire and that one's a vampire. And Martin's 84 years old, even though he looks like he's only about 19 or 20.
Yeah, was that ever answered?
Was
that ever addressed? Because it's me watching it, a lot of this stuff is ambiguous.
Yeah, and that was kind of the point of it.
We don't know if he's really 84 or not. Now, later on, Romero says he thinks that it's just a delusion, but he never really definitively says that Martin is not a vampire. I think it's dependent on how do you define a vampire.
Well, yeah, and that's kind of another thing too. Like I said, when we're talking about belief and we're talking about perception about vampires, Tanta Kuda has a particular perception about what a vampire is.
So I guess he fits the bill, right?
Martin also has a particular conception of what a vampire is, which he believes he fits,
right?
But he doesn't believe in all the old school shit.
Okay.
Like he's like, oh, I can walk around in the daytime. I'm not scared of garlic. I'm not scared of crosses. But I drink blood and I'm 84 years old. Okay. Now, it's debatable. It's possible that Martin could just be mentally ill. And I kind of lean toward that. Like, all the stuff that he's seeing with the romanticized vampire thing, that's just his delusion. That's not memories.
Yeah, because his other cousin doesn't believe that he's 84.
Yeah, that's Tanta Kuda's granddaughter, who also lives there. She thinks the whole thing is bullshit.
Right.
She thinks that, she feels bad, and I think maybe her feeling sympathy for Martin helps the audience feel sympathy for Martin, not only because he seems like such an innocent, but also because she thinks that he's just a boy with mental problems who has been warped by this family belief in the curse and everything that makes him think that he's a vampire, and that maybe it messed him up.
Although it's never really made clear whether or not she definitively has proof that he is not 84.
I don't know. She doesn't. But like I said...
Because it is ambiguous from the way that's how I saw it.
It is left ambiguous.
Okay.
But like I said...
That's how I saw it. I saw it as
ultimately,
ambiguous.
It doesn't really matter. Because it doesn't matter that she doesn't believe he's a vampire.
Right.
Tanta Kuda believes he's a vampire, and Martin believes he's a vampire. Right. They believe two different things about vampirism, but they both believe they're... and so reality stems from their belief. Like the things that happen stem from their differing beliefs. Now, because Christina, who is the granddaughter, she is not privy. She doesn't know. I don't think she knows that Martin is a serial killer, obviously.
Yeah.
But all she knows is that her whole life, she's heard the old people in the family from the old country back in Lithuania talking about, oh, there's 3 vampires still in the family and we have to destroy them and all this other kind of stuff. Because, that's the whole point of the movie, and that's kind of... There's a lot of black humor in this as well, because the funny part of this is that really, as soon as you see the whole opening sequence on the train, and then Tanta Kuda brings Martin to the house and pretty much says, I'm going to save your souls and I'm going to kill you.
Right.
You know what I mean? So it's kind of like, and it's kind of funny because you're like, wow, this old dude's crazy. But Martin is crazy too.
Yeah.
So in a way, it's kind of like a sad movie.
Right.
And I want to talk too a little bit about the relationship that he has with Mrs. Santini. As soon as Martin comes to town, Kuda has like a butcher shop or a grocery store or whatever. And he gives Martin a job like going around making deliveries. And he meets this kind of 70s stereotype of the lonely, bored housewife who's just looking to get some. Mm-hmm. But they kind of establish this kind of thing. So I've been reading some stuff about this, and somebody made the interesting point that had Mrs. Santini and Martin actually developed a normal sexual relationship, which they seemed kind of moving in that direction, sort of, even though they were both very damaged, that maybe he would have gotten out of his delusion, if indeed it was a delusion. You know what I'm saying? Like, because his whole thing was that maybe his vampiric tendencies kind of, it seemed like it was implied that it stemmed from, like, sexual inadequacy.
Yeah.
Like, because he was like, well, they have to be asleep, or, I have to get blood from them. And then after he started having this relationship with Mrs. Santini, he started having a hard time, like, picking victims, and he couldn't, like, detach himself from his victims anymore. So there is kind of that implication too, that it was a psychological issue that was manifesting itself through the lens of his family's, superstitions.
Right.
Is, I think, what it was. like I said, it's left ambiguous. He could have been a vampire, or he was just a serial killer. He was mentally ill or whatever. But I have to say, too, I have to give props to John Amplas, who plays Martin in this. This was actually his first movie role. George Romero saw him like on stage, like in some school play or some shit like that, and thought, that's him. And he put him in the movie, and he carries the whole movie. He's so sympathetic, and yet also kind of otherworldly and weird, but you kind of see everything through his eyes.
To me, he kind of looks like an evil and demented Mark Hamill.
He does kind of look a little bit like that.
I wouldn't say evil and demented, just kind of a demented Mark Hamill. Kind of reminds me of Mark Hamill.
Yeah, he does. And I was going to say, I couldn't remember if John Amplas had actually been in any other movies, but he was actually in a bunch of George Romero's other movies. He was actually in, if you guys saw Creepshow, which I want to do a show on eventually, he was the dad in Father's Day that crawled out of the grave, I want my cake, but you couldn't tell it was him because he had so much, he looked like a skeleton or whatever. But that was him, and he had a couple other bit parts in most of his zombie movies and shit later on. I think he teaches performing arts in Pittsburgh now, but, he was really great in this movie. Everybody's really good in this movie, and it's, one that doesn't get seen a lot. And if you kind of like the vampire as disease type of thing, which you kind of saw in The Hunger and maybe like The Addiction and some kind of later movies like that, this seems like it was probably kind of where some of that came from.
Yeah, I can recommend it if you like Night of the Living Dead, if you like vampire movies, if you like 70s movies.
Kind of slow burn type of movies.
Then I could recommend it. It does have some slow parts by today's standards, but they edited movies at a different pace back then. The priorities were a little different.
Well, because everyone didn't have ADD.
They didn't have ADD back then. Nowadays, they'd condense this movie into probably about a half hour. And it would still be a watchable movie. Not quite as fast-paced as Night of the Living Dead. But still good. Real good. I could recommend it.
Interestingly, he wanted to shoot this entire movie in black and white also.
Yeah.
But the producer said no.
Yeah, I don't think it would have been as cool.
So he only did the fantasy versions. Like when you see things from Martin's point of view, it's done in black and white.
No, I think that creepy, shitty 1970s color really works.
It really did help
works
out
for this movie.
Yeah, and like I said, I didn't even mention the thing about the
with that weird soundtrack, just kind of like a demented music, and it's not demented on purpose. It's just
that's just the way it came out.
Kind of shitty, yeah.
It's just the way it
came out. It is kind of makes you feel detached from it. It's weird. You'll see.
But yeah, I really like this movie. So like I said, if you like that kind of slow burn 70s sort of thing, and if you like Romero's other movies, it's kind of a similar in theme and similar in tone to some of his other ones, but this is kind of his modernist, skeptical take on the vampire legend. So if you haven't seen it, you should probably check it out. And remember, if you like the show, to like, share, subscribe on all your social media and share with all your friends. If you'd like to financially support the show, you can go to our Patreon page at patreon.com/13o'clockpodcast, or you can go to our blog, which is 13o'clockpodcast.wordpress.com, and there's a link in the sidebar to a PayPal account where you can give a one-time donation if you'd like to. And remember to check out our regular episodes, which come out every Tuesday, and our movie reviews, which come out every Friday. And until next time, bye.